important this sort of thing is in this particular debate. Around 2 billion people on this planet do not have the accessibility to eat food other than grain types of food. Any other type of food that we have, like meat, like how do you say, these type of things, are made by using grain types of foods, etc. Also, when you have rising of prices of food, you have rising of all other things, etc. Because people have to give more money for these sorts of things. So other prices also escalate based upon this sort of thing. We're going to prove to you one very simple thing, that when we break up these companies, they are no longer able to have their monopoly over this sort of thing. So people are able to give a better, more stable life based upon this sort of thing. Let's talk about the model. Firstly, we will break them up so that there is even competition between these sorts of teams. What is this number? It could be 20, it could be 30, it could be 50. We don't know. We cannot quantify this sort of thing, but we will break them up in a smart way in order to do this. We have fiat. Secondly, we will make it illegal for them to consolidate in the future. Otherwise, we are in this, how do you say, loophole of debate where they could consolidate in the future. We'll simply make it illegal in this sort of case. What is the logical conclusion of this model? Firstly, they're likely to specialize in a particular segment, in grain, in corn, in these type of things, because when you're small, when you don't have such scale, when you don't have such information, when you don't have buyer personas and all these sorts of things, you need to specialize in order to exist on the market in this particular case. We think they will be within a particular grain, there will be different competitors, but this is something important. Now, I know what they will say. We will regulate these particular companies. So this is why the first positive material from OG is going to be why you're better able to regulate them on our side of the house. Why can you not regulate them on their side of the house? Because these companies have huge lobbying power on a couple of levels. Firstly, they simply have a lot of money that they can give directly cash on hand to politicians in order to fund their campaigns, in order to control them, so they stop regulation. Not, this is bipartisan regulation similar to military-industrial complex in the United States of America. These companies are very powerful, they're very rich. Secondly, they literally keep countries hostage with this particular medicine. Not medicine, but like with this particular tool. Because when you're literally, the livelihood of so many voter base are contingent on this sort of thing. When literally they can ramp up the price of bed and stop the, how do you say, the standard of living on these sorts of things, this is something extremely problematic. So they're putting political hostage in these type of things. So even if they're able to use some of our political capital, all of these things can be reversed via lobbying, etc. Why is lobbying asymmetrically not on our side of the house? Because firstly, when they're able to do this sort of thing, you have a game theory between them. You have uncertainty whether or not they're able to lobby together the same type of entity. Some will lobby one political party, others may lobby other political parties, so they're not able to consolidate this particular thing. But secondly, they simply have less resource to lobby and control this sort of thing in this particular case. Why is this so important? Because there are a bunch of regulations that are necessary for this type of things. Firstly, in the status quo, these companies are private. You don't have access to their financial statement. You don't have access to what type of different stuff happens. So if we increase the probability of regulation, you're better able to see what are their, how you say, different things that they're doing. They're able to be more scrutinized, and that's in the moment when it's likely to more regulate. So the extent they're going to counter prop regulation, we asymmetrically explain to you why it's better on our side of the house as first contribution. Let me tell you why. No, let me tell you why you how do you say, we are better able to lower price of grains on our side of the house. 5 mechanisms here. Firstly, notice that you have inelastic demand upon this particular good. All people have to use this on a daily basis, and other food industries also have to use grain based upon this. You know, in order to have pork meat, you need to have grain and these type of things. So there will always be huge demand for these types of services. The problem is when there are only 4 competitors, they're able to use this huge demand to ramp up the price. On our side, when there are multiple competitors, when each and everyone will be competing with each other, they will lower the price in order to limit this particular case. Because yes, there is still huge demand on our side, but there are multiple actors who are able to provide this, thus lowering this. Secondly, this is the second thing, you have limited competition on our side of the house. These companies are literally, how do you say, you cannot differentiate them one from another. They're practically the same companies because they're oligopolies. They provide the same services, and it's comfortable for them to do this in this particular case. They have a cartel type behavior. Like, this is why we need to break them up. When we don't break them up, it's harder for them to collude. You don't know who will screw you over. That's when your primal incentives kick in, so they will not have this cartel type behavior. But thirdly, just because they have this scale, they're able to, I'm not sure if this is an actual word, but hangers, like place where you put the food, this could become a meme, also place where you put the food in order to store it. When they're able to use all of their money to create these type of hangars, etc., they're able to put the grain in this sort of thing, so they have huge leverage over other countries. They can wait out the negotiation process in these type of things. They can simply say, aha, you don't want to buy our grain on this price? Sure, we'll simply keep it until you need necessarily have the moment. So they're able to basically keep them hostage based upon these sorts of things. Fourthly, in many of these cases, these companies actually become producers themselves because they want to vertically integrate their supply chain. They start up buying up more land. They start up buying up more things in this particular case. This is a problem because they're creating artificial monopolies within countries, like for example in Africa, Eastern Europe, etc. And they're able to, how do you say, cut costs, so they increase their margin profit even more in this particular case. But 50, and this is super important, sometimes they force you to buy certain things that are not in your interest. So let's say you really want grain, they also try to push out you sunflower oil and all of these particular things, and they strong arm you in this particular case. They are not able to do this when there are so many companies, and you can go necessarily to the other guy. So this is how you say all of these problems are more solved when you have more of these companies in this particular case. Sure.
These are large companies that compete against each other. You want every type of grain to have one single monopoly for the type of grain. How does that make any sense?
No. Okay, maybe I didn't say this clearly, but type of grain has 4, 6, 5 companies in this particular case. Yes, they will specialize in type of grain, but there is no reason why they will monopolize in type of grain. But secondly, there exists no competition, guys. These companies, they have cartel-like behavior. They know that you are, how do you say, in the vulnerable state in this particular case. They know that they can strong arm you. If I can think of this in 15 minutes, guess what? These people have already thought about it, and they're doing this in this particular case. Now, I want you to notice the following framing. All of this is happening in the context of Ukraine grain crisis, when price of grain is likely to skyrocket because of the war happening there, because you have less exposure, etc. So there is a necessity for us to do this particular policy right now, because all of these mechanisms that I explained to you will ramp up even more. What does this mean for approximately 4 billion people around the world? Firstly, it literally means that many people will simply starve to death. Millions of people will not be able to have food because all of a sudden it's not accessible. Their governments are not going to be able to buy this sort of thing. But any additional thing that you get, any additional standard of living, like for example, how do you say, service jobs are also applicable to this sort of thing with the grain prices. You know, like cafes that want to give out like bakery stuff and these type of things. So jobs will be lost also when they ramp up these prices and do these particular things. So the only way for you to resolve this problem is on our side of the house, and basically, like, I don't know, scale of vulnerability, all of these sort of things. These people are many, they're vulnerable, we're able to give them a lower price. Easy, Ojuman.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. We are happy to concede that these companies have a cartel-like nature. I'm going to analyze in my speech why it is a good thing and even a necessary thing in the agricultural field, and why this is the worst timing to ruin it. Before that, few points of extended rebuttal. Firstly, to the whole idea of it is going to be impossible to regulate because they have so much lobbyism, etc. Just as a basic fact check, because we are still debating the real world right now, right? As you know probably, almost all countries today have price control on basic foods like bread. If the lobbyism would have been so strong, there's a question about why this is the case. And the reason for this is exactly the reason that OG described, which is people need grain so direly for every single aspect of their nutrition, meaning that it is so politically unpopular to make it inaccessible to them. Obviously, politicians cannot just afford to allow all of this lobbyism to completely prevent it. Secondly, all 4 of these companies are actually based in the United States, meaning that at best they have lobbyism power directly on the Senate. But they sell grains to the entirety of the world, where they don't have political influence, but still export grain too, meaning that you get the benefits of having more quality grains to people, but governments can easily regulate them. Thirdly, we think it is really, really easy to make it accessible otherwise, right? Like, here's the fun thing about grains and how Africa already, effectively in many countries, already violate property rights of these companies, which we are fine with, because you just take the grain and then you sow it in your own land. And this is how they take GMOs that the US subsidized and bring it to actually developing countries, which is great in our opinion. Cool, let's move on to the points. Firstly, this is the worst possible timing to do this. And I want to point out that the government does not have time-setting fiat, and even if they did, Prime Minister didn't do this. So let's move on to why we think this is a terrible, terrible time. Okay, I think that there are going to be few immediate results of this breaking up. Firstly, you're not going to be able to immediately revive all of the sub-branches of these companies. The reasons for this are A, you do not have collaboration and chains of supply that you have already built. Prime Minister tells us, oh, but you can just have them specialize in different kinds of grains. This would be nice if this would have been a retrospective motion about how this industry would have been formed in the first place. Realistically, the way it works right now, if you think about it logically, is American companies hold lands in Vietnam and other countries where land is much cheaper for agriculture and has the better types. And there they grow all different kinds of crops and import it, then export it to the rest of the world. Meaning that A, you can just differentiate them into different brands, into different types which they're going to specialize in. And B, you have a disconnect between where the grain is being produced and where it is being sold. So when you disconnect it, it's really fucking hard to resolve. Secondly, you have problems of patent and research secrets. A lot of the reason why these companies are so successful globally is the fact that they have advanced research that makes their crops much more useful. Again, it is so much cheaper to grow grains in the developing world. The reason American companies manage to outdo all the world on this is because they have advanced research on how to make crops that are A, more durable to different climate crises, and B, can produce more per the meter. This means that when you break them apart, obviously in every legal deal you have like division, you get this patent, I get this patent, so you're not able to use as much. B, future research will obviously also not be shared among all of them. So you lose a lot of this like ability to utilize it throughout the world. Thirdly, the fact that often the fact that it is also just really hard to adjust, right? Like, here's the thing about grains. You plant the ones that you do not eat. When you immediately produce less of them, because now you have an immediate shock of breaking up the company, you have less stocks to sow again. If you're going to have some branches of these companies in countries that currently suffer from a food shortage, you're going to need to sell all of them, and you have less stocks to use for the next harvest. What are the impacts of this in this particular time frame? A, there is a global food shortage as a result of labor shortage after COVID, as a result of global warming, and obviously the result of the war in Ukraine, because it was a big exporter of grains. So this means people will be hungry on government side on the immediate term. Secondly, it increases immediate inflation, because as they explained, grains are so relevant to the sustainability of all of us, and when you have a shortage of them, it means that the prices of them rise in a way that probably increases the expenses of all households, so that they contribute to the massive inflation we all see. Thirdly, it means loss of jobs for many people in developing countries, which are the main ones currently working for these companies. Secondly, let's give it to them and say, even if they're going to be able to adjust in the end and in the long term have sustainable small companies, we actually think a cartel is great. We think that specifically the field of agriculture is one that needs stability, and that stability exists through bigger concentrated companies. This is due to three main reasons. Firstly, they have more money reserves. This means that if they have an immediate problem of having less ability to fund themselves because of an immediate crisis or break in supply line, they can weather it out and wait for longer until things get rough. This is something that small companies cannot do. Secondly, they also have ability to adjust to it via research. Your ability to fund research to adjust to global problems such as increasing climate change only exists when you have added money and revenue from a big corporation that small revenue, whatever margins is not going to be able to afford. Thirdly, because it allows you to diversify risks in two ways. A, grain types. When you have a large company that produces everything, it means that if temporarily there is a weather that makes rice very hard to grow, I can grow corn and make profit out of this. Similarly, they can also diversify risks in terms of countries. If there's a temporary war or a weather problem in one country, I can keep growing in another country. All of these things don't happen when you have single small companies. I'll take closing.
It's just empirically incorrect that these firms employ large numbers of, say, Egyptian or North African farmers. Obviously, they employ people who are concentrated in specific regions where there's the ability to produce a ton of grain, right? It's not killing domestic industries.
This is a very good rebuttal that best answers one, impact, and also factually incorrect, but I hate arguing on facts in debate, so let's move on and research it for 3 years. I don't know how to prove why it's just wrong. Cool. Why do we think this stability is super important in the field of agriculture? A, just because of all the analysis OG gave you about how agriculture is important, and we can't afford to be stuck without it for several months when there's a crisis just like now. Secondly, because we think that the likelihood of crises and instabilities in the field of agriculture are very, very high for several reasons. Firstly, Because it's super volatile to weather changes. And this is something that happens more and more when we have global warming across the world or polluting environments that become no longer viable to grow crops in. This means that we need this stability to be able to pay off this when we have times of crisis that will become more and more frequent because of the weather. Secondly, because we think that any sort of global supply chain shortage is going to be problematic in this sense. Every time that there's going to be a war in a country that is a main producer of something, we're going to run into a problem that we will have a shortage, and we will not have the immediate resolution to this under government's world. Beg you to oppose.
All right, good. Good. So I come from Bulgaria. A month ago in Bulgaria, the price of oil came from €1 to €4. And this probably is more for you if you're not coming from a country like mine, but for the average Bulgarian, this was pure chaos. It was pure chaos. People were lying in the street. There was violence in order to supply because they were worried it's going to jump to €5 or €6 on the next day. This is what I lived through. It is not fucking true that all countries have this particular price control on these basic foods. I don't think there is structural analysis as to why this is likely to happen, but there is structural analysis on our side of the house as to why these companies not only have the ability to lobby governments to not put these particular prices, but also this ability is increased over time to the extent in which they're buying more land, to the extent in which they're buying, they have more ability to store these things, larger amounts of these things over this particular time. So it's not okay to just say we can completely regulate it. And I'm not sure if a country increases that regulation, if it's so fucked up, you're such a big corporation that you can just say, oh, fuck you then. I'm absolutely not going to sell you any type of grain until you increase the regulation, because the current regulation is fucking up my business model. I'll just sell it to the next highest bidder. Especially this is important if the next highest bidder is a country that has much more money, like the US, like Western Europe and things like that, compared to Bulgaria. So the increase in prices also means that a lot of these poorer places where people generally have a more vulnerable population towards these particular prices are even more fucked on their side of the house. This is extremely important. Now what they say is basically the first thing is there is this is going to be done in a bad way if you do it right away. Like, this is not our model. Obviously, like, you're going to tell these companies, you're going to have a process in which they figure out how to differentiate particular resources. I think what's important here to say in terms of this connection, this is actually better on our side of the house, because look, bigger corporations have pretty much settled things, and it's very easy for them to predict, I'm just going to take the things from Africa and bring it to Europe, and that is fine. Smaller companies that are competing within each other in a particular sector have a much bigger incentive to diversify the locations that they're getting their particular grain seeds or things like that on our side of the house, because they don't want to sell the same grain, or because the other corporation has already got this particular place. But to the extent in which they go to the same place, this is better for the local population. Why? Because they have more bargaining power. If I am a farmer in Africa and there's 2 more corporations or 3 more on our side of the house that come to me, this probably means that I can say, well, I can give you this price, or I can give you this particular price. Now, obviously, this is going to be normal negotiation, but I think that to the extent you should balance that particular balancing power, we get more benefits also for these particular countries. These countries are hugely important. There are like literally 50 countries in Africa that are like part of the developing world. 50 to 90% of their GDP is in the agricultural sector. Over time, these companies currently are buying up the land of particular farmers and things like that. This essentially makes them not only cartel in agricultural sector, but absolute cartel towards these particular governments, because all of their people are working in this particular corporation. You have zero bargaining power as a government to step in and say anything if they can essentially say we are only in this particular land. And look, it's not so easy to just make policies like we're gonna take all the land, because this sends huge problematic messages to any kind of private company that comes in your sector, that you can just flip a finger and say we're not going to take your private land, we're going to take your private like anything private in the sectors. These governments have huge incentive to seem more free trade, more capitalistic to a certain extent, in order to make sure that FDI and in different types of sectors is coming in these particular countries. Extremely important. You cannot just like completely take land away whenever you want. Okay, then on research, I think that like I'm not sure how much better you can get. It's pretty much simple. You you're a farmer, you get the grain, you put it on the boat, you get to the next country. I'm unsure how research can helps to a larger degree. Then they say they have these 2 arguments about in the short term, you're gonna have stock problems, but and also you can diversify grain types and things like that because of the weather. Governments know these things. Governments buy up huge reserves of these particular important commodities in the status quo. This is extremely important to understand. So governments are prepared to battle very easily short-termistic booms and downs in the particular supply cycle. The problem is the long term, and how do we deal with these corporations in the long term? And this is extremely important as comparative. We are not only talking about wheat only or grain only. There are multiple types of these resources. You make bread, oil, all of these things. When there is a crisis with wheat, like grain currently, you can use this to your advantage to also basically bump up the prices in the other commodities, because you control and you're engaged in the negotiations for all of these commodities. And now you say, if you don't give us a higher price for oil seeds or things like that, we are not going to give you the grain that you so desperately need, because currently there is a shortage in the supply. On our side, this breaks up these corporations, meaning that you have different negotiations between each of these companies, and these companies are trying to undercut themselves within the grain field, within the oil field, and things like that. Extremely important in terms of where do we get lower prices on our side of the house. Then they say cartel is good. First of all, these are smaller companies, but they're still pretty big, and it's a good sector. You can take huge loans if you need to diversify these things and pay up for a lot of the things that they need in the status quo. And banks are, because it's a safe sector, are likely to give you these huge loans because they understand that you're going to be able to pay them back fairly easily. At the end, I think the ability for us to have lower prices, but also the impact on developing countries that is currently getting worse, is the most important thing in this debate. And I've never been prouder to help the poor farmer woman in the developing country. So happy to propose this one.
I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Food is an integral part of people's culture and represents a principal right. No, I'm kidding, I'm not doing that. 2 things in my speech for why we win. A, we prove just access to food for significantly more people, which OG have agreed is the metric. I don't need to explain how important food is, so like it would be weird weighing it out, but I'm going to win that. Then we're also going to talk about the quality of food that people have and why that is a crucial part of this business as well, and you get more of it. Let's talk about food access. First of all, I just want to preempt this weird principle and this claim that this is a cartel coming out of OG. If CG want to do it, I don't know. The logic behind breaking up cartels is that it is not good for the consumers at the end of the day. If it is good for the consumers at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that it's a cartel, we won't break it up. That is not relevant in this debate. It is dependent on the rest of it. Let's talk about food access. I basically just think that OG have a large comparative problem, but let's talk about this. Why do they think that this is going to cause harm? They're going to raise prices. Why? Lobbying. Notice that the only thing governments fear more than lack of money is hungry people, because hungry people have nothing to lose. Hungry people feel on a day-to-day basis the pain of not being able to live a sustainable lifestyle and blame the government, who they view as responsible for giving it to them. That means it doesn't matter how much money these companies throw at the government. If it doesn't translate to people having food at the end of the day, they're not going to be able to sustain their position of power, meaning that their money wouldn't be relevant to them. But notice that the companies also fear hungry people, because the hungrier people are, the more mad at them they're going to be, the more they're going to call for regulation, the more they're going to call for breaking them up. The companies themselves don't want this. They're likely to set reasonable prices. But also, there are still smaller agricultural people who they have to compete to, who offer cheaper goods on a local level that they have to compete with. So if they want to maintain their power, they still have to do that. For all of these reasons, even if they had the ability to lobby, they are unlikely to lobby and raise the prices to the extent that OG wants you to believe. But second, they're going to say, they're going to push other products. Notice that I don't care. I don't know why that's a harm. I don't know why also having sunflower oil and being able to diversify my diet and not be dependent on a single thing in the future and being more resilient to change is a bad thing. I have no idea what the impacts of that are, not going into it. And just in case they take our logic and say, but the government will just subsidize even more on our side and then we're not going to get any impacts, notice that that's not a thing that's without harm. A, because subsidies come at the expense of other things that would go to welfare, so the more I have to subsidize the most basic need of food, the less able I am to subsidize healthcare, the less able I am to subsidize welfare, the less able I am to subsidize education. That is an active impact on our side that you don't get. So even if that's true, that's a thing that happens. Let's talk about developing countries a second and access to them, right? Because they say, honestly, I'm not exactly sure what they said that's not dependent on the raising of prices, but let's explain why it happens more on our side. Notice that the technology that is used on our side that had are proved only happens in these large enough companies means that you're able to develop GMOs that are able to give more nutritious food to people, that you're able to grow on more kinds of land, that you're able to grow in different kinds of weather, that you're able to produce more seeds from, and therefore that being able to sell more while still having more to plant, meaning you can produce more in general. That means your margins of profit and your ability to give to these countries is larger, and ability to sell to them on a lower level is also larger. But also notice that they do give these people jobs, and you say, that not necessarily they won't necessarily be giving these people jobs. That comes out of CG, but notice that they have an active incentive to. Notice because they want to buy the land there, they want to have lower shipping costs for these areas, because they have to have local people working in the places that exist in these countries, which means they are likely to give these people jobs and also feed them. This is a win-win situation for everyone. But what do we show you on access, which is the comparative that is crucially important? A, regardless of all of the incentives Hadar already analyzed why the prices will actually get higher, there's also the point of uncertainty. In the short term, there's going to be uncertainty. No one knows who the companies are going to be. No one knows if they're likely to succeed, and no one knows if they're likely to be able to step into these shoes. This means that people stockpile. This means that countries stockpile now. This means that there is significant panic buying, which leads to rise in demand without a rise in supply. Basic economics, that means that prices rise significantly in the short term. But we think that means that in the short term, right now, with the global food shortage, people don't have access to the food that they need. But we think that that also has long-term impacts. Notice that the fact that this was uncertain now and that prices has risen and that people have reached a certain point of balance that is higher, the likelihood of being able to lower that back through these is significantly harder, and you have to go through a harder process and create enough competition to have this happen, which no one has an incentive to do to lower prices dramatically, and it's going to take a really long time for that to happen, so the impacts of this last into the future. But also, because Hadar analyzed why these companies are likely to be less resilient to both market changes and weather changes and climate change, that means the trust and the stability of these smaller companies is also lower, which means that investors are going to put less money into it, and we lose out on and they have to get that money back through raising prices, and we lose all of the technology and all of the benefits of these companies having money. For those reasons, we've shown you significantly less food access, not only in the short term, but in the long term for people. Before I go on to quality of food and technology, I'm gonna take back half.
Yeah. Do you think that cheaper food in the short term is good if it comes at the cost of volatility, the ability for countries to control their own domestic grain industries, and
I genuinely, seriously, if countries do a bad job or a worse job of controlling their own grain industry in a way that means people get less food and less quality food, yes, I think it's bad. Let's move on to technology and why people get actual quality food, right? First of all, the technology and the GMOs, it's not just I plant it and then it grows. No, it's more nutritious food and plants that have higher levels of protein in it. It means things with less disease. It means that things are resilient. And it means that people know how to store so they can ship more of it at the same time and ship it for a longer time, and things keep longer, which means that you're losing less of the things, you have more supply, prices go down. But it's also, you can prevent actual disease like this. Look that if you have access to the relevant technology, then you can make sure that you're preventing disease and storing things properly. The ability of diversification means that companies have an incentive to prevent this disease themselves, because they can take the hit of preventing people from getting sick in the short term to make sure and sell them a different grain or grain from a different place in the long term so that they still make a profit. And it's also easier to track exactly where that disease is coming from, because there isn't a weird so many companies who use the same supply chains to reach the same country, which means that you're more able to track it. At the bottom line, that this means that people have access to more nutritious food, which means they're getting more energy, which means they can work more and feel better and aren't sick and aren't tired, and they're not getting harmed or diseased by these companies and by the food they are being offered. Because we showed you both better access to food and access to better food, we win this debate. Please oppose.
Cool. Is the panel ready? Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Our extension will take opening opposition at their best. Food prices have largely gotten cheaper due to monopolies, and even though OG is right and eventually this breakup will likely drive down prices, it's fairly intuitive that in the short term and historically, monopolies through cross-subsidization and a variety of other mechanisms have made food cheaper for countries to access on aggregate. Our extension will explain why cheaper food in the short term isn't good if it comes at the cost of volatility, the inability for countries to control their own food markets, and dependency on incredibly risky global supply chains through the war in Ukraine and things like this. Note framing first. The reason prices are high is because the companies that produce grain have had a significant incentive over the years to concentrate the development of grain in specific bread baskets of the world that produce 70, 80, 90% of the total amount of grain that feeds most countries around the world. The reason they have the incentive and capacity to do this is they're large firms, and concentration in single areas allows for you to develop economies of scale at significantly greater rates, which you cut costs to other parts of the supply chain to export things far faster and far cheaper. Secondly, you get benefits from talent in richer countries, so you concentrate in the West in countries that are proximate, i.e. Ukraine, which is near to the European Union. You can easily import wealthy scientists and things like that to engage into things like genetic engineering and things like this. But thirdly, concentration means you only need one supply chain from one country and a single spoke on the wheel importing to different countries, rather than multiple supply chains that are significantly more costly and engaging with multiple distributors that cost you more money. What this then means is that at the point at which Ukraine, which is one nation, produces something like 70% of global supply, and other countries in specific European countries in America produce the remaining 20%, at the point at which you have an exogenous economic shock, COVID, war, anything, this reverberates up and down the supply chain to a massive degree. What these firms have done is they've made that risk incredibly, incredibly bad. This fucks over the developing world. Some responses to opening opposition before I get into extension, who I'm very happy I finally get to respond to. On research, note that duplicate costs are far harder on their side. Note that a few firms have much stronger enforcement mechanisms to shut out state-funded research and things like this because they can litigate the state if the state is engaging in things like violating trade secrets. They can litigate its private scientists who are engaging in similar research to them and shut them down. They can get patents to research things on 5-10-year time horizons that make it far harder for them to do so. The comparatives, when you break them up, they have less money to litigate those kinds of things. They're less likely to do that because they have to compete and so on and so forth with one another, so that's probably pretty good. But finally, there's just a lot of exogenous incentives to research on either side of the house because governments want to develop this technology, scientists want to develop this technology. At the point at which you have less regulatory capture involved in this, you probably get more of it. On job loss, note that companies, and as I've said, have concentrated most actual growth in a relatively small number of countries. What this has meant is that most of these jobs operate overseas, i.e. they don't employ large numbers of Egyptian farmers, they employ people in specific areas outside the country. The reason for this is when you concentrate these resources in 1 or 2 countries, you pay a smaller number of people for the same amount of work, which is why you have single, like, large bread baskets that produce a massive amount of the world's grain. That's incredibly important. Finally, weighing on inflation. We're fine biting the short-term bullet if it means we reduce massive amounts of instability. I'm going to prove that now in extension. Why does this extension beat opening government? The problem with OG is that they say lobbying. This doesn't engage in fiat. O can ban lobbying too. It's probably fair that the regulation works. Why, regardless of lobbying, is breaking these countries absolutely essential? Firstly, when you have 4 or 5 large firms, they can easily collaborate intangibly. In the same way that AT&T and Time Warner are able to intangibly collude in the telecommunications market via price setting, they can when there are a few players and have an incentive to cooperate, right? Because when there's very few, any defector who lowers prices will get punished by others, right? So if prices are high, that's incredibly bad. When there are so many players, now the cost to defecting is much lower because each firm has significantly reduced capacity to punish you. But secondly, it's very, very hard to prove silent collaboration via antitrust. Most companies do not have the money to engage in antitrust suits at this kind of scale, which means that these companies just have way more money to litigate against you. What is the actual harm of these countries, which is way worse than more expensive food in some instances, which opening opposition contests? What has happened is that these larger oligopolies have concentrated a lot of the world's supply in a relatively small number of countries. There's a large number of former agrarian economies reliant on this. Note that a lot of these domestic markets have skilled, historically agrarian economies and have a lot of ability to do this. Like Egypt, highly fertile land, lots of ability to develop grain. They don't do it to the same degree now because their domestic industry has been fucked over by this. What have they done? Firstly, they've lobbied, right, to underfund or cut state support for those domestic markets, i.e. shutting down Egyptian grain factories, the Lebanese grain industry. They bought off politicians and shut down factory farms to import grains instead by giving them price caps to set them low or preferential subsidies relative to domestic firms. But secondly, they've aggressively outcompeted local distributors every turn because Taman Hadar are right. They can provide grain at massively below cost rates to people in these countries, even though they import from half the world away because of economies of scale. What this means is that those domestic grain industries are completely fucked. But thirdly, they have made the countries dependent on the functioning of global supply chains. This means when there is an endogenous economic shock at any point in the supply chain, economic crisis shuts down the entire Malaysian economy, or political crisis like the Turkish coup that happened a few years ago, or the war in Ukraine, at any point, market failure fucks over these economies because now the price of grain goes very high. What has this done? Firstly, it means layoffs, job loss, and so on massively because the grain industries have moved overseas outside these countries. But secondly, it means that these countries' markets are, despite fertile land, really fucked over because now they can't transition back as easily or as quickly. But thirdly, it's meant that these countries in North Africa, Egypt, Lebanon, and massive amounts of Africa are wholly dependent on these kind of things. What does this mean? Firstly, the price of grain goes up in the short term. This is probably good in certain countries, right? Egypt probably needs a stronger grain sector because it allows them to make money off of that, get a broader tax base, cross-subsidize other failing industries, and transition better to high-tech manufacturing and things like this. But secondly, in the long term, even if it's more expensive, the price of grain is less volatile, which means there are less supply fluctuations, which means that even if we get higher rates, we get more consistent rates, which means that your economy is more stable, which means it's a prerequisite to unlocking things like FDI, investment, and so on and so forth. But finally, if you have an internal supply chain, this means when one company goes under in one country, even if these companies sometimes fail, right? Because we're going to bite the bullet. Sometimes these state companies might fail. This is still better because if the Egyptian grain industry collapses, this does not cause economic contagion to other countries with their own domestic grain industries. So what this then means is that those other countries are less systemically vulnerable to failures across the supply chain. So at every stage, we're better off. What are the harms? Firstly, food shortages get far, far worse because the supply chain is really bad. But secondly, when few people are employed in critical sectors, right? Because low-skilled workers get laid off. So we flip opening opposition because opening opposition is, more unemployment. But it's incredibly unlikely that unemployment materializes. The unemployment is far worse on their side because they're concentrating all that talent and employment in a few small countries, a few large countries, as opposed to many others. But finally, certain countries have control over other countries. Before I unpack that opening.
Both us and OG prove these companies have the incentive and the ability to spread across the whole world. The premise of your case is that they are concentrated in one place and one supply chain.
Listen to my extension, Hadar. What I said was the companies operate everywhere. They concentrate the production in a few countries. They operate everywhere through import-exports. Even if they operate in some of those countries, they operate at far greater rates elsewhere. And even if they have some presence in Egypt, for example, they have lobbied to undercut that to a significant degree. What this then means is that there's less functional grain industry in that country, which means insofar as it's cheaper to import it from abroad, they import it from abroad, meaning the government doesn't have an incentive to fund that industry to the same degree, meaning it dies far faster. It is a lot of nuance here that you did not engage with. What is the way? This is by far the largest impact in the debate, because at the point of view of instability in these countries, this is political, this is really bad. You get like things like instability, potentially like war and things like this, but at the point at which food shortage happens, you also get right-wing backlash, populism, things like this. I think that's really bad. Finally, on better functioning firms, OG says cheaper grain. Their mech is competition. The COPI is smart. Why does competition work? Firstly, vertical integration in the status quo across multiple business lines mean that you can underpay distributors and make it harder for people to work in supply chains to negotiate wages. What this means is you fuck over workers at every stage of the supply. On our side, A, it's easier to regulate distributors because you break up the firms horizontally as well as vertically. So now you can regulate the distributors to get like more regulation on each supply chain. But secondly, management inefficiencies of scale. I'm shocked Ruben doesn't say this. So the quality of food is way worse because we have very large firms that are doing this as opposed to smaller ones that can concentrate the resources at a specific point. You get far better food quality on our side of the house, but also just more investment. You get greater diversification of risk, so we're so much better off on their side. Incredibly proud to win from closing government.
Panel, the game of agriculture is an infinite game. That means it doesn't end at the end of the season when the needs of this season have been met, but rather the outcome of this season directly feeds into what happens the next season and the season after that and for the next 5 years. The problem, and I can't believe this is an extension that is open, is that agriculture, as has been conceded in the debate, is inherently risky and volatile. That means that security doesn't rely on global supply chains right now, it relies on stockpiling. Because notice, grains and oils are things that can be stored for many, many years. Here's the problem. If you break down the ability of distribution companies to build up insanely high reserves as they are currently doing, they are then able to use in bad harvest years, which are going to come more and more in the future, that is when you create hunger, not just for this season, but for years on end, and that is when you actually screw poorer countries, right? The problem is that for some reason, OO is worried about, panic stockpiling and short-term shortages. I am worried about not stockpiling enough. I am worried about these companies not having enough capital to stockpile as much as they should, which they will not on government side. That is the extension with which closing opposition will win this debate, right? Because the problem is if you lower the safety net ability and you make the entire planet vulnerable, not just right now, but systematically for the entire duration of this idiotic short-sighted policy, that's when you screw poor people. I'll start with dealing with CG and then I will mechanize my case. So the problem with CG is that they focus on concentrating development. Here's the thing, that is something that's controlled by production companies, not distribution companies. They don't actually explain exactly why necessarily changing these distribution companies is going to somehow change the structure to which producing companies change the way they operate. If anything, I think in that area there will be less competition because now suppliers will probably only have the ability to focus on supplying and not also on production, right? But more production concentrated where it's cheaper actually just means more production, more crops for your buck, better and cheaper, right? The responsibility and the ability to distribute is what you should count in this debate, right? Because production, actually, like location of production matters so much less than where these crops are being stored, given that there are literal hundreds of tons of these crops that are being stored every year or across the globe. So what happens if you now break down the abilities of these companies to afford to have stockpiling centers spread out all over the world? Rich countries are going to be able to stockpile on their own. That is probably not something they're going to be affected in the very short term. They probably can weather many different years of crisis. The countries that cannot afford to stockpile on their own and actually are reliant on these distributors being able to meet the demand are the smaller countries. Here's the problem. If you can only run so many stockpiling centers, you will probably put them in the country that is able to pay you the higher price if there is a shortage, right? That means that the first ones that go are the ones in poorer nations that they are so concerned about. That also means that now, given that the stockpiles are no longer happening there, and the servicing of the demand there is happening just in time. So like you kind of wait for the order to be put in and then you start shipping it. That is when they're vulnerable, also in the short term, to production, to supply chain disruptions, right? But like also producers massively, also still have massive power to outcompete local producers. I'm unsure why that changes. What does change, however, if you make the servicing companies smaller, is you raise the threshold at which they start, which starts making financial sense for them to service your country. OG somehow seems to assume that the reason why prices went up right now is because of these firms. No, the reason why the prices went up, and look at the correlation, is because the cost of distribution went up. I already explained to you why you make distribution even more expensive. So given that the majority of expenses in distributing grains comes from delivery, I'm unsure why OG is relevant in this debate, but Marina will deal with that, right? But another point on CG before I move on is that the local production reliance that they somehow seem to want, because they want small farmers to be able to keep producing and be the ones that also deliver, because they're small delivery companies within their country. That also means that you probably drive out a lot of large suppliers, a lot of large producers. This is particularly bad for poor African countries that they so badly want to protect, because if you let them be self-sufficient, that works in years with good crops. But what happens in years with bad crops when you've already driven out the other companies? Why would they bother to come service you? Especially given that you probably can pay less than the US or Sweden can, right? That is also where climate change hit the hardest. There is also where there is least technology to be able to mitigate it. There is also where you have the least dams, you have worse irrigation system, you have much more risk. Let's look at the long term. I think there are two things that you need to care about in this debate that no one, I don't know how, but no one mentioned this so far. One, you need companies to be able to fund consistent overproduction. They need to buy up everything that gets produced, even if it's more than they have to sell. In order for them to be able to do that, one, they need to have the cash reserves to have that. Two, they need to have the fucking money to be able to afford to store them. Because storing grains is not something you can just put in your basement and assume they won't go bad. These actually do require quite a lot of high technology. These also require quite a lot of money. Like, I'm sure OO can have some small impact here because they talked about innovation. I don't even care about more innovation. I care about being able to afford the technology we already have in order for you to be able to afford stockpiling grains. Opening, do you have a POI?
On our side, with the prices low, governments can stockpile grain because they can buy it cheap.
Yeah, look. That's symmetric. They can do that on both sides of the house. I'm unsure why they can't do that right now, right? The problem is you need to prove why they're able to stockpile as much as they possibly need at the moment where you've made suppliers unable to have enough stockpile to service you in years where crops are low, because they're probably always going to choose to service the US first, right? That probably means that if you've diminished their ability to fulfill all of their orders in years with bad production, and notice this is something you can't fix, right? You can't just order from a new supplier right now if that supplier wasn't prepared to do it, because you cannot evaluate the crops of this year pre-hawk, right? You only know when you're already fucked that you are fucked. That is the reason why you need insane amounts of money being poured into stockpiling. If Egypt cannot afford to pay a tiny price hike in higher delivery systems, I am unsure how Egypt is going to be able to afford the technology to build their own stockpiling facilities and also enough money to buy enough wheat to feed their population. Notice the reason, OG's analysis on you have power over countries is silly, because you're unlikely to get contracts from 10 different companies because you have fixed costs, and also because you lose whatever discount you get from buying a lot of land. So countries are still probably going to be only serviced by one company and dependent on them. Now you diminish their ability to switch to a different producer because other producers aren't going to be large enough and have enough stockpile built up to service you. That's when you get less competition, and that's why CO wins this debate.
Whose water is this?
Oh, sorry.
Can I sip? For POIs, I'll let you know when I'm ready. don't verbally interrupt because it throws me off my game. Great. Three, two, one. If debates were won by years of research into a particular topic, I would win all sex debates. But I don't. I think we're... That's my intro. Let's nuke the other teams. On CO, note Mira's response to us is that producers and distributors are not the same. But they do produce and distribute insofar as top half literally agree that firms are vertically integrated. It is literally the premise of OO's cheapness case. Secondarily, I want to really dismantle their case. Their case is there's less stockpiling that exists on our side. Similar kind of vibe that they're going for with OO. One note, when countries have more control over their own grain supply, they can better project better year-to-year yields, meaning they end up being able to project and account for shortage better, which means that you probably get more accurate forms of stockpiling. But let's say you don't buy that. Secondarily, when companies have less money to sink into things like stock buybacks or executive compensation, they essentially stockpile more by definition in order to make substantially more profit. But let's say you don't buy that. Thirdly, the race to stockpile is substantially better when there are 30 firms who want to be the firm to solve the shortage you want, to have the competitive advantage at that point. I think Matt substantially flips their argument when he says that when there's less volatility, this allows, or there's less risk, this allows for firms to stockpile substantially more when there's a greater number. But even if you don't buy any of the rebuttal that exists to CO, the case that deals with OO will also deal with CO. Let's now take out OO. OO's case is cartels are good in the context of agriculture, maybe not in other industries, but specifically with agriculture, because they create more stability, and stability is very important. We agree entirely with the framing on stability, but disagree that you get it comparatively more on their side or in the forms that they want. Let's dismantle and flip their mechanisms. The first mechanism they have is you have more money reserves and agricultural capital in case of shocks because they're bigger firms, more economies of scale, etc. Note why we flip this, because they isolate the stocks and reserves in particular countries. I want to make clear why the stockpiles are substantially more concentrated. Firstly, firms have incentives to mitigate risk. When you keep it in one place, it's less susceptible to things like government seizure, instability, etc. But secondarily, supply chains have to be separated out, which geographically separates. Literally also said by the LO. At the point in which you have to separate out those supply chains, it essentially means that by definition, those stockpiles have to be more widely distributed in the world. Maybe they don't get full control over a particular form of grain, but it is comparatively more, insofar as it is comparatively more widely distributed. But I want to make the comparative clear to be generous. Even if there are slightly or moderately less reserves that exist on our side, in terms of the stockpile, the total world number that exists, I would prefer a smaller stockpile that is more widely distributed. Because note the implication or the endpoint of their arguments. You want stockpiles so that people, citizens of the world, will be able to ensure that they have access to food during shortages, etc. That stockpiling doesn't matter if it is isolated to particular countries that otherwise do not have to distribute that widely across the world. I would take a smaller stockpile if it essentially means that more people have access to it. Let's get into their second mechanism, funding research, which would then increase the size of the stockpile. Note they gave us a mechanism literally in their case for how you make research easier, which is now you distribute the patents and research secrets. Yes, this might be bad for the profit of a particular firm, but this is great for the innovation of the industry. This was literally conceded by the LO that an issue with this is that you would have to give up trade patents and secrets. This is so good because now innovative industries are now able to have access to this thing or these researches and these trade secrets that would otherwise prevent them from being able to innovate and discover more ways to provide higher stockpiles. But thirdly, they say, diversification of risk by country. I don't know at all why you diversify risk by country on their side. Note the incentives I gave before that exist, for you as a firm have the incentive not to spread out all of your stockpiles all across the world, insofar as now you can control all of it. The benefit of having it in one particular country is now even if some of it is less able to be widely distributed, you know for a fact that the country you put it in will not have it be able to take it away. So that engages with the cost-benefit calculus that exists with a particular firm for why they would want to diversify or not diversify. But even if you don't buy that, the supply chain breakdown by definition has to separate around the world between producers and distributors. So by definition, you get more diversification of risk on our side. Now, let's engage with the OG case and do substantial weighing them. So I want to be very clear that we are not derivative and that we engage with opposition on their framing. But first, I'll be charitable and take a POI from OO.
We could increase profit margin and more grains produced via research and diversification of risk. Without this, there aren't enough grains to stockpile and money to conserve them, CGs and COs and
You need to explain why the economies of scale are so large that you cannot otherwise have reasonable amounts of stockpile that exist on our side. That is critical because the value of a stockpile has diminishing marginal returns over how much it is. Even if on their side you get more economies of scale, if you have like 1,000 barrels of wheat, but you only need like 500 to escape the shortage, having like another 12 or 1,300 for more economies of scale isn't explained to me why it particularly matters. So that mechanism also falls. Let's be very clear why we beat OG. We will also engage with why we beat opposition. Their response to lobbying ignored the fiat that opposition has. By definition, the motion on our side would overcome lobbying with some magic wand. That's the benefit we get in this House with motions. This means their side also has a magic wand to do so and to make those particular regulations, for example, long-term in time. They get a magic wand as well to do it. What does this mean? Their case is entirely contingent on the idea that op cannot regulate away the availability of competition or create competitive incentives. What is my better response that Matt also said that I will explain more, that engages with the structural inability to deal with oligopolies? Silent price setting. That is to say, the example Matt gave you of like AT&T and Time Warner or like Coke and Pepsi. Why do they have this incentive to silently price set? Because it's mutually beneficial for those two firms. They don't ever have to collude, and this is the particular issue. OG says they collude. I don't know why they collude. I genuinely don't know why or how they collude. And note why this is critical. The point is that any antitrust law or regulation that exists on op cannot prove collusion or sanction because it's entirely implicit. But that collusion gets comparatively harder when it is more atomized between different firms that cannot reasonably price it. That is critical to then beating the opposition bench, why they cannot have their cake and eat it too, like our side. But I also want to make clear their mechanism for price of grain going down are not mutually exclusive compared to Matt. The first thing they say is less competition on opposition side. But I don't know why oligopolies can't compete. Why does competition need 30 instead of 4? The reason why you need it is, or their whole case is relying on the power leverage that corporations have. But why can't buyers leverage one corporation against another? Because there are 4 of them. What Matt tells you and I explaining the price setting mechanism is because you can't when they can implicitly price set. You need it to be atomized because it's harder to set implicit signals between 30 different people that you want to increase or decrease the price. That is critical to beating OG insofar as that's the response to opposition bench. Hopefully I can get better at winning sex motions.
Sorry. Okay. Ready? 3, 2, 1. I just want to say if I'm unable to understand a speaker because of the speed, I think the panel should take that into account, that not everything is just understandable just because they say words that I don't understand. They have to explain them in a way that everyone in the debate can understand them. So, framing. I think there's 2 things that we need to prove in this debate in order to win, and I think Miri does that. Note, it might sound simple, but I don't think that just making the most complex is always the path to victory. First, why there is a unique ability of monopolies or of these big companies that they can uniquely fulfill that on their side they cannot fulfill. And then I weigh this and I explain to you why overproduction and storage matters. First, I will deal with some rebuttal to our case and then weigh against opening and their POI. So first, on rebuttal on like you don't produce in small countries or you do produce in small countries. First of all, I think that where you produce is probably limited by geographical facts.
Like, if there's a desert, you can't produce there. If there's grass, you can probably produce there. So I think that to the extent that there's possibility to produce somewhere, if you can, most farmers already use this for production. So I don't understand why Egypt as a whole will say, no, we will not use this grassland to produce because Ahmed said so in his week. Secondly, big companies will still put their storage there because it's much better to have stockpiling in the place and then have a cheaper distribution to the different villages there, etc., in order to then distribute from there. Note that it doesn't make sense to have like a stockpile that is as big as one city in one place and then take out marginal like buckets of whey and then carry that to another country. I think it's much better to have like different big storage facilities at different continents, different places. I think this is very weird rebuttal. Secondly, note, and this is where we become very comparative and Ahmed doesn't really engage with this. The ability to storage is less. This is already a comparative. Secondly, we say it's much less. And what does this mean if everyone is able to stockpile less? If you have like 30, 50 companies, if everyone stockpiles less, the chance to be replaced by other contracts, if you're unable to meet your duty to actually give this person or give this country the way that they asked for or whatever, it's much more likely that you will not be able to find a replacement because everyone stockpiles less, meaning that it's unclear why you will find someone who's able to actually fulfill the contract. Thirdly, if there's other huge companies, if I lose this contract, this means even if it's small, it's likely they will stick to this other competitor who is now able to fulfill this. Meaning if the Balkans want this wheat and then one company said, sorry, we don't have it, there's other big companies that probably have that and that can step in. Then note, why do smaller countries matter? I think because they're like hit by the climate crisis the most. It's not their fault, it's our fault. Secondly, the response to this is governments can stockpile. Note, the facilities to stockpile need to exist first, and you need to build them. Note, this costs a lot of money to get the ventilators, to pay people to do this, etc., all in nearest analysis. But also, you need to justify this to people in a time where you don't have a food shortage yet. Note that a lot of other political issues on voters' minds, like immigration, how do you say, will we give women more rights, LGBTQ, religion, all of these things. And you as a now very rational politician need to say, oh, we need to build a huge stockpiling facility in order to buy crops because maybe in 10 years we will not be able to buy this. I don't think that governments are that smart, and even if they were, voters will not buy this. This is where these big companies step in. This is what they do for the governments, basically. Then OO says, oh, research is important. First of all, okay, maybe it's important, but it's unclear to what extent it's important, and at best it shows you that you need the ability to have crops in order to do something. They never tell us why they have incentives for this. Not probably to research GMOs or something. You don't need huge amounts of money. You need like a few cells and a lab, I think. I don't know. It's unclear why you need huge resources to do this, but it's very clear why you need huge resources to store a lot of wheat. Note that this is simplistic, but it's the most likely scenario, because even though maybe Hadar knows a lot, that's the problem. She didn't explain all of this well. Maybe in her paper she did. Then, the second thing, why do you need so much money for this? The space, the electricity, also the people who safeguard this in cases of crisis, who risk their life to safeguard this stockpiling, etc., when people want to riot and get it. All of this costs a lot of money. You need big facilities who will do this. Then on rebuttal and incentive analysis. So they say prices go up. I think prices only matter if you have something to sell. Why? They never explain to you why you will have crops in first place to sell. We tell you that if they are not able to fulfill your contracts, you probably don't have any alternatives. It doesn't matter how high or they don't go. Note that we also have different response to this in order how government can regulate. There's so many things that don't involve going against the companies like lobbying, which is rationing, subsidies directly to the people, food stamps, the government buys this. This is when you can actually get CG, where they say, oh, governments will buy this actually. They can cut back on military and buy lots of food. This is much more important because it's directly on the government voter incentive analysis and not based on whether lobbies will exist or not. Before that opening.
The problem is this is not a retrospective motion. All the cities are built. The difference is when you have multiple actors, you'll still have same quality of grain, but lower price.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, you can leave storage facilities half empty. You don't need to fill them, right? You need to overproduce constantly in order to actually fill them and actually to have that. Meaning that maybe if we do this right now, for the next 10 years, we may be okay. But what after that? Meaning that this is exactly not retrospective, but prospective. You never explain to us why you're going to fill these storage units with the amount of wheat, why you will have actual protection, or why you will not sell it for someone to build offices, hotels, whatever they want there, use it as like for different industries, etc. Then, note why is this also so important? Because this is exactly what CG and OG want. It's a response to crisis. Note, you need to overproduce in previous years in order for people to get the food that they want, in order to respond to crisis. I think this is also where prices are a lot more stable. Because if you have, and OO says we have more agricultural capital. What is agricultural capital? Miri explains to you that agricultural capital is exactly the storage that you have, the wheat that you overproduce, etc. They cannot just like say one headline and then Miri spends 4 minutes analyzing this and saying, oh, but we said it. Note that by debating, we prove to you why it's much likelier, what this exactly means, and why it's competitive. For all of these reasons, vote CO.